Well, without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker. Dr. John Van Sant is Associate Professor and Graduate Program Director here in our Department of History at University of Alabama at Birmingham, where he has been since 2000. His doctorate degree in history is from the University of Oregon, while his undergraduate and master's degrees are from the University of California at Davis. He has won several awards, including the Fulbright Award for Japan, and here at UAB he won the 2003 Frederick W. Connor Prize in the History of Ideas for his paper on Sakuma Shozan, Philosophy of Eastern Ethics and Western Science. His general area of research and teaching is East Asian history, while his primary area is on Japanese history during the Tokugawa and Meiji eras? Meiji eras. I need the expert to keep these straight. His recent research focuses on what is known in Asia as troubles from within and without, and how these events and influences affected Japan during the last decades of the Tokugawa era. Dr. Van Sant is also active in the World History Association and in the Advanced Placement Program for World History. So I think we're in for a treat by a real subject expert who is going to tell us about Rangaku medicine as outside knowledge in late Tokugawa Japan. Welcome, Dr. Van Sant.
Thank you, Mike, for that introduction. I'm supposed to, can everybody hear me better? Right. But just to give you a warning, we tested the sound system earlier today and it sometimes did some weird things. So if I sound too loud and obnoxious, please let me know. Rangaku emerged in Japan in the 17th century as a result of restrictions that are known as sakoku, or closed country policies of the early Tokugawa shogunate that placed on Japanese interactions with Westerners. And now the Tokugawa era begins in 1600. And employees of the Dutch East India Company were the only Westerners allowed in Japan from 1639 to the 1850s. Now, although generally known as Rangaku, or Dutch studies, because the medium of transmission was usually through employees of the Dutch East India Company, and they were based at the small Deshima Island in Nagasaki, and also through Dutch language books, the information and knowledge transmitted was actually European in origin, and therefore is sometimes more accurately called Yogaku, or Western studies. I use the term Rangaku because that was the most prevalent term at the time, and still really the most prevalent term. Just to be aware, though, the content is not necessarily all of Dutch origin. The major spread of Western medical ideas within the realm of scientific knowledge in Japan during the Tokugawa era began with the publication of Kaitai Shinsho, or New Anatomy book, in 1774. Now, I will get to that in a moment. But not only would the publication of Kaitai Shinsho greatly assist Japanese physicians in correctly diagnosing and treating their patients, even for physicians who relied primarily on Chinese medical knowledge, it would lead to other advances, especially the acceptance of Jennerian cowpox vaccination. And furthermore, at a time of national crisis caused by the internal disputes between the imperial house and the Tokugawa shogunate, and exacerbated by foreign external powers demanding trade and diplomatic relations, this medical knowledge played a little known but significant role, I would argue, in establishing the Meiji government. Let me back up a bit. This is the Dutch enclave in Nagasaki, Deshima Island. This is Nagasaki mainland right there, and then you see the island there. Deshima Island is sort of a fan-shaped island. It's kind of a stretched out, maybe a little bit bigger than a football field, And this is where the Dutch traders had to live on this island, and they could not even, almost never could they even cross the bridge into Nagasaki itself while they were based there. There were guards all over the place. So this is what the island looks like, this sort of fan shape. And by the way, it was actually an artificial island. It was built in the early 17th century by the Tokugawa government, with dumping landfill and all of that there. So they were, I don't know who's the earliest at building artificial islands, but it is actually an artificial island. Now, it's not there anymore. If you go to Nagasaki today and you ask for where's Deshima Island, there are streets. It's been filled in all around it, but it is still there. And this is the Dutch trade network during this period of time. And the East Asian main base for the Dutch is here in Batavia, Indonesia. And it is from Batavia that a couple of times a year the Japanese government would allow ships to come up to Nagasaki there. But in 1721, Tokugawa Yoshimune, who was the 8th Tokugawa shogun, he rescinded long-standing restrictions on foreign books that could be imported by the Dutch trade ships at Nagasaki. He was especially interested in information about Western horsemanship, botanical sciences, astronomy, weapons, and medical techniques. More Japanese scholars were sent by the shogun to study with the Dutch at their compound in Nagasaki, and during their required annual visits of the Dutch Overhoofd and his entourage to Edo, more Japanese scholars would also meet with the Dutch during their stay in the shogun's capital. Edo was the capital's name. In 1868, the name was changed to Tokyo. A European doctor of medicine was employed by the Dutch East India Company and was always included in these journeys to Edo. All the Japanese who met with the Dutch, either in Nagasaki or Edo, needed to receive special permission from the Tokugawa government. And since hardly any member of the Dutch East India Company, with one or two rare exceptions, learned more than a smattering of Japanese vocabulary and salutations, the medium for communication was in Dutch and was extremely cumbersome, as you can imagine, especially for scientific concepts and medical procedures. Nevertheless, interest in Dutch science, in Western science, especially medical knowledge, increased among Japanese physicians who sought to compare and add Western medical knowledge and techniques to their existing Chinese base of medicine. On March 4th, 1771, there won't be a test on the dates, a watershed event took place that would soon dramatically increase Japanese interest in Western medicine. The physician, Sugita Genpaku, along with Ryotaku Maino and Junan Nakagawa, they were allowed to observe the dissection of the corpse of a 50-year-old female criminal in the Kotsugahara section of Edo. Kotsugahara, by the way, was mainly one of the 3 areas in Edo used for executions. Now, according to Sugita's later account, the woman was originally from Kyoto. She was known as Aucha Baba. Aucha Baba literally means green tea hag. And she was executed for a, quote, a heinous crime. I've looked up both the Japanese of what Sugita wrote, but it just means heinous crime, no other description of what that is. An elderly man who was a member of the Barakumin caste performed the dissection. The Barakumin were outside the traditional Japanese legal and hierarchical system, samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants. Yes, merchants were at the bottom. But they were kind of, the Barakumin were sort of outside the main caste system, somewhat similar to the untouchables or Dalits of India. And they were the only ones allowed to handle the corpses of animals and humans. Now, the elderly Barakunin man told Sugita that he performed several dissections since his youth. Sugita and his companions, they brought along a Dutch medical text, the Ontaling Tafeling, or anatomical tables. They brought this along with them in order to compare the diagrams and drawings inside this Dutch text with parts of the dissected body. Now, according to Sugita's later account, and I'm quoting from it here, on this occasion, the old man went on explaining various organs, such as the heart, the liver, the gallbladder, and the stomach. Further, he pointed to some other things and said, I don't know what they are, but they've always been there in all the bodies I have so far dissected. Checking them later with the Dutch charts, we were able to identify them to be the main arteries and veins and the suprarenal glands. Comparing the things what we saw in the pictures to the Dutch book, Ryotako and I had with us, we were amazed at their perfect agreement. Come back in a little bit. Sugita then mentions that he and his colleagues examined some bones that were still laying around in this dissection area. And he found that, quote, they were nothing like those described in the Chinese books, but were exactly as represented in the Dutch book. We were completely amazed, unquote. The elderly man told Sugita and his companions that whenever previous doctors watched him perform a dissection, they never asked questions or showed much interest. Moreover, Sugita was aware, through a friend of his who worked in the shogun's office, that a few of the shogun's doctors had recently witnessed dissections, and they had written down about the differences between what they had seen in the Chinese anatomical texts. However, they explained the differences by believing that Chinese and Japanese had different internal structures. Okay. Now, 3 years later, after painstakingly working to translate the Dutch anatomical text, Ontaling Tafeling, and by the way, I know I'm mispronouncing that. I may be of Dutch heritage, but I do not speak Dutch. But the Ontaling Tafeling, Sugita Genpaku, Rotaku Maino, and Junan Nakagawa, they published Kaitai Shinsho, or A New Book of Anatomy. And this is like the cover and the introduction of what you're seeing right there. Unknown to Sugita and his colleagues, Ontaling Tafelin was actually the Dutch language translation of the German work Anatomisch Tabellen by Johann Adam Kolmes, and was originally published in 1722. And this marks a turning point, arguably the starting point, really, of systematic study of Western science in Japan, because Kaitai Shinsho is the first Western medical text. Indeed, it's really the first Western scientific text of any kind translated into the Japanese language. Here we see, this was like the cover, first introduction page, and I have a couple of pages here that I've taken from the National Library of Medical Sciences database. Shinzo, heart over there, of course, on the left. Lungs. This is a copy of the Anatomisch Tabellen by Johann Adam Kolmes. This is the actual origin of the book that they were comparing it with, but they apparently did not know that. They thought it was a Dutch origin book. It was really from the German and originally published in 1722. Now, to most scholars, to most Japanese scholars at the time, with the notable exception of the Kokugaku, or national learning scholars. Now, the national learning scholars are very anti-foreign. They believed in a sort of mystical Japan back in the legendary era. They believed things like Buddhism and even Confucianism were foreign pollutants in Japan. So we'll put them to the side for now, but be aware they actually did have some influence later. But aside from these Kokugaku scholars, for most Japanese scholars in Japan during the Tokugawa era, the Middle Kingdom was still the center of the East Asian and Japanese universe. The yin-yang nature of the cosmos, the properties and interactions of the five elements, fire, earth, metal, water, and wood, and Neo-Confucianism, based on the writings of the Chinese philosopher Zhu Shi of the Song dynasty. These were the basis of scientific knowledge. Knowledge from the West, the European scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, was at best a sort of haphazard mosaic of exotic information and understood only through the prism of Dutch merchants in Japan and the Dutch language. So, and as you can imagine, many pieces of this mosaic of Western knowledge were missing and misunderstood. A major setback to Western medical practices in Japan, and indeed a setback to all Western scientific studies in Japan, occurred as a result of the von Siebold incident of 1828. As the German physician, Philip von Siebold, was preparing to depart Japan after serving 5 years as the physician to the Dutch East India Company at Nagasaki, Tokugawa government officials discovered prohibited artifacts in his departure crates, especially maps of Japan, which was considered a national security information. These Tokugawa government officials. They're basically the Tokugawa TSA officials. They caught him. And these prohibited items had been given to him by Japanese physicians and scholars he had met 2 years earlier, in 1826, when he had accompanied the Dutch officers on their required journey to Edo in order to meet with shogunate officials. Japanese officials, scholars, and physicians who had met with von Siebold during his 5 years in Japan, either in Nagasaki or in Edo, were accused of treason. About 30 were arrested and jailed. Some were executed. And even Takahashi Kageyasu, who was the highest-ranking Tokugawa government official for scientific affairs, he was arrested and died in prison. By the way, he was posthumously tried and convicted of espionage. Now, the von Siebold incident occurred a couple of years after increasing intrusions by Western ships, especially Russian and British vessels, that had compelled the Japanese government to reinforce, strengthen earlier closed country or sakoku policies with a new expulsion edict to repel Western ships by force. Von Siebold was held under house arrest for 1 year and then he was deported from Japan. Now, by the way, actually von Siebold a few years later wrote a book, Flora and Fauna of Japan, in Europe, and it was probably the first Western book about flora and fauna of Japan. Now, any Japanese who was associated with von Siebold with Western medicine, or even had a strong interest in Western science, was tainted with suspicion of disloyalty to the shogunate. According to Ann Janetta, Japanese students of von Siebold who survived the government crackdown developed networks of medical knowledge that continue to exist and expand, albeit more discreetly and especially in the rural areas of Japan rather than in the urban area of Edo and Osaka. Well, the von Siebold incident and the shogunate's suspicion that those who sought Western knowledge also sought to disrupt and perhaps overthrow the shogunate's rule, one can say clearly delayed advances in Rangaku medicine for about 2 decades. By the 1840s, Japanese Rangaku scholars and physicians had become aware of cowpox vaccination. And they became aware of it, of course, as a method to combat smallpox, a disease that often devastated areas of Japan. Through Dutch medical texts that had sort of been snuck in, Jennerian vaccination methods became known among those who had earlier studied with von Siebold or studied with his surviving students. Government officials in Nagasaki on the island of Kyushu, who were in contact with the employees of the Dutch East India Company, they began to ask if the Dutch could import the cowpox virus from Batavia, that is the Dutch base in Indonesia, which the Dutch did in 1849. And then when Nabeshima Naomasa, the daimyo, that is the feudal lord of Saga Domain, and Saga Domain includes the port of Nagasaki, when he heard that cowpox lymph had arrived aboard a Dutch vessel, he sent his chief physician to acquire some of it and to learn from the Dutch physician, Otto Wonke, how to perform a vaccination. And on October 8, 1849, Nabeshima Naomasa's oldest son and heir to his domain was vaccinated against smallpox and survived. Within 1 year, several instructional pamphlets, woodblock prints, and assorted stories of cowpox vaccinations were produced and distributed throughout much of Japan. The Tokugawa government did not officially approve of this Western medical practice, but they did nothing to stop vaccinations from taking place. They even did nothing to stop vaccinations from taking place in Edo, where their headquarters. This was one of the woodblock prints. Circa 1850, might be 1850, might be 1851. This shows the cowpox child on a cowpox, and he is basically driving away the demon of smallpox with this vaccination. Now, despite the interruption of the von Siebold incident, from the publication of Kaitai Shinsho in 1774 by Sugita Genpaku to the smallpox vaccination of Nabeshima Naomasa's oldest son in 1849, Western science generally, and Western medicine specifically, proved to be effective outside bodies of knowledge that could be incorporated into Japan's traditional East Asian-based knowledge. Although there were arguments over the efficacy of vaccination, mostly by Chinese medical practice physicians who worked for the shogun, Jennerian vaccination became widespread in Japan where available beginning in the 1850s. One person who pointedly refused to be vaccinated was Emperor Kome, who was in nearly all respects anti-Western. He was primarily upset that the shogun and his officials in the 1850s and 1860s had agreed to negotiations and treaties with Western countries. His displeasure with the shogun and the Tokugawa government was well known. And samurai warriors from Satsuma and Choshu and other strong warrior-dominated domains in Japan joined forces and adopted his anti-Tokugawa stance, and they overthrew the Tokugawa shogun's government in early 1868. Technically, the Tokugawa shogun's government in the Meiji era begins on January 3rd, 1868. Emperor Kome, however, had died 1 year earlier at the age of 36. He died 1 year earlier in January 1867. He died from a smallpox epidemic in Kyoto. Emperor Komei's death from smallpox was well known at the time. I mean, there was a smallpox epidemic going around Kyoto at the time. However, unknown to the public until 1933. In fact, I believe this is unknown even to many of my fellow historians today. But in 1933, the Meiji Tennoki, that is the official record of the imperial household of the Meiji Emperor, was first published. Emperor Komei's only surviving child, Prince Sachinomiya, was vaccinated on orders from his maternal grandfather, Nakayama Tadayasu, in 1857 as a young boy. Upon his father's death, Prince Sachinomiya became Emperor Meiji and reigned until 1912, during what most scholars would call the industrialization or the modernization, if you will, of Japan. Emperor Meiji was more politically open to Western ideas and Western ways than his father, though he personally preferred Japanese traditions. And arguably, the medical procedure of cowpox vaccination, first developed by Edward Jenner and then adopted by Rangaku physicians in Japan, made it possible for him to ascend the imperial throne and lead the nation as its sovereign and sacred leader during this crucial era of Japanese history. This is Emperor Meiji still as a young man in the late 1870s. Now, another very interesting part about this, so Emperor Komei dies in January 1867. His only surviving son ascends the throne and then begins the Meiji era. Tokugawa Iemochi, the shogun, that is the other big power in Japan at this time, he had died just 5 months earlier, August 29, 1866, only 20 years old, and it appears that he died from beriberi, or vitamin B1 deficiency. So Tokugawa Iemochi, who dies in 1866, who had been a controversial choice to be the Tokugawa shogun, and was not liked by the leaders of Satsuma and Choshu and other strong warrior domains. He conveniently dies. The very virulently anti-Western emperor dies a few months later. And they are replaced by people who are, shall we say, a little more open to Japan adopting and adapting to these outside influences. And by the way, among my fellow historians, I think almost none of them make this sort of connection that maybe one of the reasons the Meiji era happened was these two gentlemen both dying, within 15 months of the beginning of the Meiji period, helping to create some political and intellectual space for adopting outside influences. Now, at nearly the same time that Prince Sachinomiya, backtracking here, was vaccinated for protection against smallpox in 1857, there was a samurai scholar, actually Mike mentioned him in my introduction, Sakuma Shozan, who intensely studied Chinese Confucianism as a young man, and had later studied Western science just as intensely. And he had written that the pleasures of the educated Confucian gentleman were, quote, he that is born after the age of Asian reason and logic were enlightened by Westerners and thus understands principles unknown to the sages of ancient times. And the final pleasure of the Confucian gentleman, Sakuma continued, quote, is to thoroughly investigate Eastern ethics and Western scientific arts, whether fine and spiritual or large and coarse. By combining this inside and outside knowledge to the matter, he will benefit the people and bring favor to the nation. by the way, Sakuma Shozan wasn't the only one who had those kinds of ideas, but he certainly was one of the most prominent. It's unrealistic to argue that Western science played like a decisive or the decisive role in the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1868. Political and economic relations with Western countries and internal political disagreements between the imperial house in Kyoto and the Tokugawa shogunate in Edo were the primary reasons for regime change at this time. And few, if any, that I'm aware of Rangaku scholars had called or publicly called for the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate. Many of them didn't like the restrictions placed on them from time to time, but few, if any of them, had called for the overthrow of the Tokugawa government. Yet the expansion of outside or scientific knowledge, including Western medical knowledge, did benefit the people and bring favor to the nation during the last years of the Tokugawa shogunate and throughout the succeeding Meiji period. This is a picture of Tokugawa Yoshinobu, who succeeds Iemochi. Again, Yoshinobu, a little older, a little more mature, and he, after trying some too little reforms of the shogunate, he realizes that he's going to have to give in, and so he actually resigned his position. He was the last shogun, resigned in November 1867. But again, he took his position because Tokugawa Iemochi had died of beriberi. Now, despite the general stereotype of Japan as a closed, isolated country, the actuality is that Japanese scholars, artisans, producers of culture have had a long tradition of being inquisitive and open to outside ideas and influences, long before U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry had supposedly opened to Japan in 1853. I mean, even Buddhism and Confucianism were ideas and values that originated from outside the Japanese realm and migrated to the Japanese islands around 500 AD. Government officials were naturally concerned about outside influences, such as firearms and Christianity, which could upset the internal social and political order. Thus, the implementation of the sakoku, or closed country rules, in the 1630s. Nevertheless, outside influences were permitted and even encouraged if they could be adapted and utilized for the benefit of the Japanese people. And with Kaitai Shinsho, Sugita Genpaku and his colleagues demonstrated the usefulness of the medical knowledge of outsiders, in this case Westerners, and that Chinese medical practices were not always the most useful or correct. Kaitai Shinsho dramatically increased interest in Western medical and scientific practices among Japanese physicians in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Although it should be said, Chinese medical practices continued to dominate right up until the Meiji era begins. And after some delay because of the von Siebold incident, cowpox vaccination too demonstrated the usefulness of outside knowledge. And so, compared to other countries, Japan is not necessarily unique in its interest in outside knowledge. It is unique, I would argue, however, in the determination of many Japanese, such as the Tokugawa-era Rangaku scholars, to utilize knowledge for the benefit of its people. And again, the Meiji era begins, and you can sort of see a difference right there immediately in the clothing. This is the first cabinet officers of the Meiji government. They're now dressed in Western-style clothes, Western-style uniforms. Meiji era quickly develops industries such as the textile industries. Here's a silk spinning factory of the time. New bridge and fashions in Kyoto. Train at Shimbashi Station. Commodore Perry had brought a relatively toy train in the 1850s to Japan, a working model of a toy train. By 1871, Japan had built a railroad line from Tokyo to Yokohama. Classrooms changed. This is early in the Meiji period. See, the students here are still wearing kimono-style dress, although the teacher here is wearing Western-style dress. This is a mathematics class. 45 plus 81, 126, is that right? But also, you know, later in the Meiji period, the Meiji government became more aggressive, imperialist, colonialist, as you might say. The First Sino-Japan War of 1894 and 1895 fought over Korea. Again, Western soldiers using Western weapons here. And then 10 years later, fighting against Russia in Manchuria and Korea as well. And Emperor Meiji is an older man who would die in 1912. So I would argue that Western medical science, and in his case specifically cowpox vaccination, we don't know this for sure, but you know, might have saved his life. And he became the symbol of the new and industrializing Japan for the next 40-some years. Thank you very much.